The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the quiet town of Willow Creek. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air as people made their way to work, exchanging friendly greetings with their neighbors. Main Street Café was the heart of the town, a place where stories were shared over steaming cups of espresso and where regulars felt like family. Before we start, this channel won't survive without your support. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second and it helps us grow and bring you more incredible stories. Behind the counter, Richard Grayson, the cafe manager, wiped down the polished wood surface with swift, precise motions. He was a man who believed in order in his cafe, order in his town, and order in the kind of people he served. To him, some folks belonged, and some folks didn't. The bell above the door jingled, drawing Richard's attention. He'd barely glanced up before returning to his task. Another customer, no big deal. But then, the murmurs started. Standing just inside the doorway was an older black man, dressed in a worn leather jacket and dark jeans. His salt and pepper beard framed a face lined with wisdom, his strong posture revealing a lifetime of discipline. His name was Samuel Hayes, a war veteran, a man who had once left this town to serve his country, only to return years later to find that the battle wasn't always fought on foreign soil. Samuel took a step forward, his boots clicking against the hardwood floor. He surveyed the cafe, memories flickering in his mind. He had once sat at that corner booth with his wife, sipping coffee on chilly autumn mornings. He had laughed with friends at the counter, swapping stories after long shifts at the factory. Those days felt like another lifetime. He approached the counter, his deep voice calm but firm. "Morning, I'll take a black coffee and a slice of peach pie." The young waitress behind the counter hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously toward Richard. Before she could answer, Richard straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "We don't serve people like you here." The cafe went silent. Conversations halted. A fork clattered onto a plate as someone froze mid-bite. The air grew heavy, thick with tension. Samuel's brow furrowed. "Excuse me." Richard leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. A smug smirk played at his lips. "I said, we don't serve people like you. You can take your business elsewhere." A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. Some kept their heads down, pretending not to hear. Others watched in stunned silence. Samuel exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. He had faced worse, much worse. He had been shot at, bombed, seen friends die in his arms. A disrespectful cafe manager wasn't going to shake him. "I've been coming here since before you ran this place," he said, his voice measured. Richard scoffed. "Yeah, well, times change. Someone like you doesn't deserve respect, let alone service, in my cafe." A ripple of unease spread through the room. A young man sitting near the window, a mechanic named Jake, stood up abruptly. "Hey, that's not right, man." Richard shot him a glare. "Mind your business, Jake." Jake clenched his jaw but didn't sit back down. A few other customers were beginning to shift in their seats, murmuring amongst themselves. Samuel, however, remained steady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He placed it on the counter. His eyes locked on Richard's. "That's for my coffee and pie." Richard snatched the bill, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it onto the floor. "I told you to get out." For a moment, Samuel said nothing. He simply looked at the man before him, seeing not just Richard Grayson, but every man who had ever tried to push him down. Then he nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, leaving behind a cafe full of uneasy silence. Jake shook his head in disbelief. "That man's a war hero," he muttered. Richard rolled his eyes. "A war hero, please. Just another washed-up old man looking for attention." Jake stared at him for a long moment, before grabbing his jacket and walking out the door. One by one, others followed. Some left in disgust. Others simply couldn't bring themselves to stay. Outside, Samuel stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the crisp morning air. He had faced battles before, But this one had only just begun. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet as Samuel Hayes stepped away from Main Street Café, his boots hitting the pavement with steady, deliberate steps. The town hadn't changed much in the years he'd been away. Same tree-lined streets, same charming storefronts, same people. But something had shifted. He could feel it as he walked. The sting of Richard Grayson's words still echoed in his mind. He had faced racism before. It wasn't new, but there was something about hearing those words in his own hometown. After dedicating his life to serving a country that often didn't serve him back, that left a bitter taste in his mouth. He stopped near a bench and let out a slow breath. The cafe had been a place of comfort once. Now, it was a battleground. Behind him, the cafe doors swung open. Jake, the young mechanic who had spoken up inside, came jogging out, his face tight with anger. "Mr. Hayes," Jake called. Samuel turned. He recognized the boy his father, Mike, had owned the town's auto shop back in the day. Jake caught up to him, rubbing the back of his neck. "That wasn't right. What happened in there?" Samuel studied him for a moment before nodding. "No, it wasn't." Jake clenched his jaw. "Richard's been like that for years. He thinks he owns this town just because he runs that cafe. But throwing you out like that was low even for him." Samuel gave a small, tired smile. "People show their true colors when they think no one's watching." Jake's hands curled into fists. People were watching, and they didn't do a damn thing. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and firm. "You did?" Jake exhaled sharply, glancing back at the cafe. Through the window, he could see Richard still behind the counter, going about his business like nothing had happened. A few customers had stayed, but others had left, shaking their heads in disgust. Jake's nostrils flared. "I don't care what anyone says. You're a hero. You fought for this country. You should be treated with respect." Samuel chuckled lightly. "Respect isn't given freely, son. Some folks think they get to decide who's worthy of it." Jake shook his head. "Screw that. If Richard thinks he can get away with this, he's got another thing coming." Samuel watched as the young man turned and marched back toward the cafe. "Jake," he called. Jake paused. Samuel sighed. "Don't start a fight." Jake smirked. "Who said anything about a fight?" And with that, he walked back inside. Inside the cafe, Richard was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled again. He'd barely glanced up before noticing Jake striding toward him with a purpose. "Here to order something, or just looking for trouble?" Richard asked without missing a beat. Jake stopped in front of the counter, his arms crossed. "Trouble? No, just came to let you know something." Richard arched a brow. "Oh, and what's that?" Jake's voice was calm but firm. "This town doesn't belong to you." A few customers turned in their seats, sensing the tension rising again. Richard snorted. "Oh, please. Just because a few people walked out doesn't mean anything. They'll be back. People like their coffee too much to stay mad." Jake leaned in slightly. "You think this is over?" Richard set down the cloth he'd been using to wipe the counter. "I don't think I know." Jake's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "We'll see." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Richard watching after him with narrowed eyes. The news spreads. By noon, the story had already started spreading. Willow Creek was a small town. Word traveled fast, especially when there was drama involved. By the time Samuel made his way to the grocery store, he could feel the stares. Some were sympathetic, others avoided his gaze altogether. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who had known Samuel since he was a boy, stopped him near the produce aisle. "Samuel, dear, I heard what happened." He gave a tired nod. "News sure does travel quick." She pursed her lips. "It's downright shameful. You deserve better than that." He simply smiled. "I appreciate that, man." Nearby, a group of teenagers whispered among themselves before glancing his way. One of them, a girl with curly red hair, pulled out her phone. Within minutes, a social media post had gone up. "Cafe manager kicks out a war veteran just for being black. Disgusting. Willow Creek deserves better." The comments rolled in quickly. Some defended Richard, saying he had a right to refuse service. Others were outraged, demanding action. Then, someone posted a picture of Samuel in his military uniform, proud, dignified, standing tall. That's when things really took off. By evening, the post had hundreds of shares. People from outside Willow Creek were starting to take notice, and Richard Grayson had no idea what was coming. The sun had barely set over Willow Creek when Richard Grayson finally noticed something was off. The cafe, usually buzzing with its regulars, felt eerily empty. The few customers who did come in ordered quickly and left without their usual small talk. Even the ones who stayed kept glancing at their phones, murmuring to each other. Richard frowned, wiping his hands on a rag before stepping out from behind the counter. "What's going on?" he muttered under his breath. A few feet away, his assistant manager, Lisa, hesitated before speaking. "You haven't seen it yet." "Seen what?" Richard snapped, already pulling his phone out of his pocket. Lisa swallowed hard, then simply gestured toward the screen. "Check social media." Richard's fingers moved fast, tapping on the app. The moment he did, his stomach dropped. His cafe's name was everywhere. Cafe manager kicks out a black veteran disrespecting a war hero in his own hometown. Boycott Main Street cafe. Racism has no place in Willow Creek. There were hundreds of comments, some from locals, others from people who had never even set foot in town. But they all had one thing in common: they were furious. Richard's jaw tightened as he scrolled. Then he saw the picture that made his blood run cold. It was Samuel, in uniform, standing tall, his medals pinned to his chest, and beneath it, a caption that made Richard's heart pound in his ears. "Someone like you doesn't deserve respect." His own words, thrown back at him like a blade. Richard's grip tightened around the phone. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "They're overreacting." Lisa gave him a wary look. "Are they?" He glared at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lisa sighed, crossing her arms. "I've worked here for 6 years, Richard. I know how you treat certain customers." His eyes darkened. "Watch yourself, Lisa." She shook her head. "No, you watch yourself, because whether you like it or not, this isn't going away." And she was right. The boycott begins. By the next morning, Main Street Cafe wasn't just losing customers, it was bleeding them. Jake and a group of young locals had made sure of that. They stood outside, handing out flyers, showing people the viral post, urging them to take their business elsewhere. At first, Richard thought it wouldn't matter. People need their coffee, he scoffed. They'll be back. But as the hours dragged on and the cafe remained nearly empty, reality began to sink in. By lunchtime, his staff was standing around with nothing to do. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but no one was there to drink it. Richard clenched his fists. "This town has lost its damn mind." Across the street, Jake smirked as he watched Richard through the window. "Still think this is over?" he murmured under his breath. Beside him, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from the grocery store, adjusted her sun hat. "Oh dear," Jake chuckled. He brought it on himself. Mrs. Thompson gave a firm nod. Indeed he did. The cafe wasn't just losing business, it was becoming a ghost town. And Richard Grayson was beginning to realize that the town he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers. Samuel speaks. Meanwhile, Samuel had spent the morning doing what he always did, living his life. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't interested in online drama. But when the local news station called, asking for an interview, he hesitated. "Mr. Hayes, people want to hear your side of the story," the reporter urged. Samuel sighed. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But if speaking up meant making a difference, then maybe it was worth it. The interview was simple. He sat on a park bench, dressed in plain clothes, and spoke from the heart. "I served this country because I believed in what it stood for," he said. "I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it for special treatment. I did it because I wanted to protect the people who live here." He looked into the camera, his gaze steady. No one should be treated like they don't belong, especially not in the place they call home. By the time the interview aired that evening, the town was already on fire. People who had once turned a blind eye were now speaking up. The mayor released a statement condemning discrimination. Local businesses began pulling their partnerships with Main Street Café. And Richard, he watched it all unfold from inside his empty cafe, his hands shaking with anger. His business, his reputation, his standing in the town, it was all slipping away. And for the first time in his life, Richard Grayson was afraid. As the days passed, the tension in Willow Creek only seemed to escalate. Richard spent most of his time pacing around the cafe, staring at the empty tables and the growing pile of unsold pastries. The cafe had become a symbol, a battleground between those who sided with Samuel and those who still supported him. He refused to accept that his actions had consequences beyond what he had imagined, but the backlash was undeniable. On the fourth day after the incident, Richard's phone buzzed again with an incoming message. His face paled as he read it. "We won't let a man like you destroy everything we stand for. You've lost my business for good." It was from Carl Thompson, one of the town's wealthiest business owners. His cafe had been a long-time supporter of Main Street Café, but now Carl had withdrawn. Richard clenched his teeth, angry at the insult but even more furious at himself. The cafe was still empty, except for a few of his loyal staff who had stayed on, hoping things would settle down. But the truth was impossible to deny. Willow Creek had drawn a line and Richard had crossed it. Samuel's steady rise. While Richard's world was falling apart, Samuel's had taken a turn for the better. The interview he gave to the local news had gone viral, not just in Willow Creek but beyond. His face had appeared on social media, on news channels, and in discussions on forums where people discussed the treatment of veterans, racism, and small-town dynamics. He hadn't asked for this, but it seemed the town, and perhaps the world, had needed someone to speak out. Samuel was invited to speak at local schools, at veterans events, and even at the town hall. Everywhere he went, people listened. He wasn't just a war hero anymore. He was a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of unjust treatment. He never sought revenge, but it was impossible for him to ignore the change in the air. People who once avoided him, who didn't acknowledge his sacrifices, were now stopping him on the street to shake his hand, thanking him for his service. One morning, as Samuel made his way to the community center to give a speech, he saw a small group of people gathered near Main Street Café. They were holding signs that read, "Justice for Samuel Hayes," and "Boycott Main Street Caf." It wasn't just the younger crowd anymore. It was everyone, the old, the young, the affluent, and the working class. Back in the cafe, Richard sat down at one of the tables, staring blankly out the window. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the reality of the situation gnawed at his insides. He had tried everything. He'd posted an apology on social media, pleading for people to understand the pressure he was under, to let him fix the situation. But that hadn't helped. His words seemed hollow, empty. The people of Willow Creek weren't buying it. They had seen enough. "I've worked too hard for this," Richard shouted, standing up suddenly, knocking his chair over. He began pacing frantically. "I built this place from the ground up. I can't just lose everything because of one mistake." His staff watched in silence, not daring to interrupt. Lisa looked at him, her face drawn with concern. "You can't undo what's been done, but you can try to make it right." "Right," Richard scoffed. "What do you think I've been trying to do?" "You've been trying to save face," Lisa said gently, "but you haven't taken responsibility for what happened. You haven't even tried to fix things with Samuel. You haven't tried to make amends with the people you hurt." Richard's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to make amends. I made a mistake, and people are blowing it out of proportion." Lisa shook her head. "It's not about just you anymore. It's about everyone in this town. What you did affected more than just you, Richard. It affected a man who gave everything for this country, a man who doesn't deserve what you did to him." Richard didn't say anything at first. He stared at the floor, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the town hall meeting was called. Richard wasn't invited. He wasn't even sure if he would have gone if he had been. But Samuel was, and so were many of the townspeople who had been supporting him. The meeting room was packed. It felt like a storm was brewing, one that Richard had no control over. The mayor took the floor, and Richard could see her eyes scanning the room, noting who was present and who wasn't. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Samuel stood near the front, looking composed, dignified, but with a clear fire in his eyes. He had seen the way things were going. This wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about the values Willow Creek wanted to uphold. Samuel raised his hand when the mayor called for the town's input. His voice was calm but firm. "I don't want to tear this town apart," he began. "But what happened at that cafe isn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper issue. This is about respect. This is about standing up against injustice. I did not serve this country to be treated like this, and I will not allow it to happen to anyone else." His words resonated in the room, and no one could ignore the impact of his statement. They weren't just words, they were the truth. The town was no longer divided between who liked their morning coffee and who didn't. It had become a battle for values, for dignity, for justice. The day after the town hall meeting, the atmosphere in Willow Creek was charged with energy. People spoke in hushed tones. Their conversations centered around Samuel's speech, Richard's actions, and the future of the cafe. There were whispers of boycotts, of protests, and even petitions to have Richard removed from his position as manager. Some were in favor of Samuel. Others still sided with Richard. But one thing was clear: Willow Creek would never be the same. Richard sat in the cafe, staring out at the empty street. The chairs were still overturned from the previous night's frantic cleanup. The walls seemed to close in on him, the weight of his mistakes pressing down like a heavy stone. The constant ringing of his phone was unbearable now. Each call either a complaint or a threat. He had tried to fix things. Really, he had. He had issued his apologies, promised to make things right. But the more he tried to explain himself, the more it seemed to make things worse. People had made their decision. They had chosen a side, and it wasn't his. "Maybe I should leave," Richard muttered to himself. "Maybe I should just pack up and go." But no matter how many times he considered running, something inside him refused to let go. The cafe had been his life for so long. He had built it from nothing, fought for every customer, every inch of space in that town. He wasn't ready to let it crumble just because of a single moment of poor judgment. He thought about Samuel again, his calm demeanor, his unyielding strength. Richard hated that Samuel had been so dignified in the face of everything. It only made Richard's actions look more pathetic in comparison. Meanwhile, Samuel found himself at the center of a movement that he hadn't expected. The town's reaction to his speech had ignited something powerful. People who had never spoken to him before, people who had crossed the street to avoid his presence, were now reaching out to support him. Local businesses offered to donate to a fund to help him open his own restaurant, and schools invited him to talk about his experiences as a veteran. But it wasn't just the town's response that shocked him. It was the outpouring of support from people beyond Willow Creek. News outlets picked up on the story, and soon Samuel was being interviewed on national television, hailed as a hero for his courage. It wasn't the recognition that mattered to him, it was the realization that his voice was finally being heard, that the people who had been silent for so long were now finding their own courage to stand up. Samuel didn't want the fame or the attention. What he wanted was simple: respect. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not just as a war hero, but as a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity. His thoughts returned to the cafe. He hadn't wanted to make it personal. He hadn't wanted to destroy Richard's life. But as the days passed, the damage had already been done. People were choosing sides, and the town had drawn a line in the sand. It was clear now that Richard wasn't going to just fade into the background. The actions of a single man had left a scar on the community, and that wound would take time to heal. On the 6th day after Samuel's speech, things reached a boiling point. A group of young people from the town organized a protest outside Main Street Café. They carried signs and chanted slogans, their voices loud and defiant. The protest wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about standing up against racism, injustice, and the abuse of power. It was about demanding respect for those who had been wronged. Samuel stood on the steps of the town hall, watching the protesters with a mixture of pride and concern. He hadn't asked for this. He had only wanted to be treated fairly, to not be judged based on the color of his skin. But now his fight had become the town's fight. Everyone seemed to be looking to him for answers, for leadership. He didn't know what the next step would be. He didn't know how to heal the divide that had torn this town apart. But one thing was clear: he couldn't stay silent anymore. Samuel Hayes had never been the type of man to run from a fight. Not now, not ever. As he walked toward the cafe, he could hear the voices growing louder. The chants rang through the air, echoing in his mind. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that he was no longer alone in this battle, and that gave him strength. Back inside the cafe, Richard was pacing again, his frustration boiling over. He knew the protest was happening, and he knew that he couldn't hide from it anymore. The truth was, his business was on the line. His reputation, his livelihood, his everything, it was all at stake. But in the midst of his panic, he couldn't ignore the voice in his head, the voice of Lisa, who had told him that he needed to take responsibility. It was the one thing that had been missing from all of his actions so far. He had been so focused on saving himself, on saving the cafe, that he hadn't even thought about the man he had wronged, the man who had sacrificed everything for his country, who had spent years fighting for people like Richard to live in freedom. Samuel Hayes wasn't just a war hero, he was a symbol of everything Richard had failed to understand. As the protests grew louder outside, Richard found himself standing at the door of the cafe. The decision was his now. He could either stand by his pride and let his town fall apart, or he could make the one gesture that might fix everything. The air outside was thick with tension. Richard stood frozen at the door of the cafe, watching the growing crowd of protesters chanting for justice, for respect, for change. Their voices carried the weight of years of pain, their words powerful and filled with defiance. It was as though the whole town had come alive with a single purpose, a single mission. Richard could feel the heat of their anger, their frustration, pressing against the walls of his cafe. This wasn't just about a manager and a veteran anymore. It was about a system, a culture, a history of inequality that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And now it had all come to a head. He stepped outside, the sound of the protest growing louder with every step. Samuel was standing at the front of the crowd, his presence commanding, unwavering. It was like something from a dream, the way he stood, dignified and unbroken, despite everything that had happened. Richard felt a deep sense of shame settle in his chest. Samuel hadn't just been right in the words he spoke at the town hall. Samuel had been right in everything he stood for. As Richard made his way to the front of the crowd, all eyes turned to him. The protesters quieted for a moment, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a thick fog. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if he was about to be torn apart by the very people he had once served. But then, Samuel spoke. "You came," Samuel said, his voice steady, powerful. "I didn't expect you to come." Richard swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at the crowd, at the people who had once been his customers, his neighbors, his friends. "I failed you. I failed Samuel. I failed this town. And I'm sorry." The words felt like they were being pulled from the very depths of his soul. A confession long overdue. He looked at Samuel, his face crumpled with regret. "I let my pride and my ignorance guide me. I didn't see you for who you are, for who you've been. You deserve more than an apology. You deserve respect." For a moment, there was silence. The air was thick, like time had stopped altogether. And then, something remarkable happened. Samuel nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I don't need your apology, Richard," Samuel said softly. "What I need, what we all need, is for you to understand. For you to understand what it feels like to be treated like less than a human being. To be told that you don't deserve respect, that you don't belong, because that's something you'll never forget. And that's what we've all lived with, day in and day out, for years." Richard's chest tightened. He hadn't understood before, but now, standing before Samuel, it was all too clear. The hurt, the anger, the years of suffering, it wasn't something that could be erased with a simple apology. It was something deeper, something ingrained in the very fabric of the town, of the system they lived in. "I understand now," Richard said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I'll try. I'll try to make this town the place it should have been all along. A place where everyone is treated with respect. A place where no one is made to feel less than." The crowd stood in stunned silence, the weight of Richard's words slowly sinking in. It was as though they had all been holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, that would allow them to believe in the possibility of change. And then a single voice called out from the back of the crowd, "It's not enough." Richard turned, his eyes widening as the speaker stepped forward. It was Lisa, the woman he had almost fired a few days ago, the one who had been quietly observing from the sidelines. She wasn't angry, but there was a hardness in her eyes that made Richard's heart race. "What do you mean?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. Lisa stepped closer, her gaze never leaving him. "An apology isn't enough. A speech isn't enough. You've got to show us, Richard. You've got to prove it, not with words, but with actions." Richard nodded slowly, the reality of what she was saying sinking in. It wasn't enough to stand there to beg for forgiveness. He had to show that he was committed to change, that he would fight, just as Samuel had fought for respect, that he would give up his pride for the betterment of the community. "I will," Richard said, his voice filled with determination. "I will prove it. I'll do whatever it takes." The crowd began to murmur, their voices soft at first, then growing louder as they realized the truth in Richard's words. It was a turning point, a moment when things could either stay the same or finally begin to change. As Richard looked around, he saw a town that had been divided for so long, torn apart by history and ignorance. But in that moment, it felt like there was hope. Hope for a new beginning, hope for healing. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a chance to make a real difference. Samuel turned to the crowd, raising his hand for silence. The crowd quieted, awaiting his words. "This isn't about one man's apology," Samuel said, his voice loud and clear. "This is about all of us. This is about every person in this town coming together and deciding that we're done with hate. We're done with division. We're done with living in the past. It's time for something better." The crowd erupted in cheers. The tension that had gripped Willow Creek for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of unity that had been missing for far too long. Richard stood beside Samuel, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. It was the beginning of something new. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was a start. And that, for the first time, felt like enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.